Alright, welcome to episode number 16 of the Ready and Imzo Larson Speedrun series, playing against three different opponents in the rating range of 2100 up to 2200. And our first opponent here, rated 2165, we're playing against Q Stan. We start knight f3, they go c5, let's go for the move b3. Pawn goes to d5. Here we do have to make sure that we play the move e3 here. If we went for bishop to b2, black would be able to set up with f6 followed by e5. Now if they go for f6, we can play the move d4 and continue to keep the control over the e5 square. So pretty standard position. We've had this a couple of other times in the speedrun series. I always forget here if we should play h3 first or bishop to b5 first. I feel like it's bishop to b5, so I think I'm going to go for that here. Pin the knight. Next we'll play h3 and continue from here. Let's go ahead and throw in the move h3. See what black does about that. If he wants to take the knight, that's totally fine. If he doesn't take the knight, then we're going to be playing a pretty common idea here. We're going to go for the move pawn to g4. Kick the bishop back to the g6 square. Now we play the move knight to e5 to attack the knight on c6 that's pinned. Black is going to have to play queen to d6 or queen to c7 most likely. And in the previous episode of the speedrun series in the 2000 to 2100 rating range, I think we had a very, very similar position. I think the pawn was on e6 and the knight was not on f6 just yet. And in that particular game, I think it was the second one of that episode. Yeah, in that particular game, we had a situation where I did go for a h4 idea, trying to trap the bishop on g6. It ended up in hindsight that that may not have been the best way to do things. Or sorry, maybe h4 itself was fine, but this idea of taking the bishop on g6 was not the best way to do things. I think this type of situation is a little bit different. Now, first of all, we can't play h4 because black would simply take the bishop on b5. The question is, do I go ahead and make the exchange? I feel like I do that here. We do have this option of capturing the knight. I would rather keep my knight on e5 alive, so I'm not really in a rush to play something like knight takes c6. First of all, if I played knight takes c6, black could also just take the bishop on the b5 square. I could also think about playing c4 to reinforce the bishop and attack the center. But I'm a little bit less of a fan of that idea, at least not right away. Though it's probably not bad. It might be useful here to hold off on making the capture on c6 because there's not really a whole lot black can do to stop it. They can't really reinforce the knight well enough that if I take on c6, they could take back with a piece at any point. So maybe here I will actually think about playing d4. The slight drawback I will say to c4 is that whenever I do play h4 later, it is always possible for the bishop to take on b1 once the pawn is moved up to the c4 square, and then black wouldn't have to compromise their pawn structure on the king side. So if I do take the knight and they take back, then I play h4. I am threatening to play h5, trapping the bishop. They'll probably have to play h6 or h5 themselves. Maybe they would, they'll pick one of the two, and then I would be able to take on g6. They would take back. The drawback to that, again, we kind of had a very, very similar position to this in the previous speedrun episode. The drawback to all of that is I'm trading off all of my kind of active pieces. I am damaging my opponent's pawn structure, but it's actually kind of awkward to develop my remaining pieces, unfortunately. Like, putting the knight in front of the bishop on b2 is not fantastic. I'd have to play some kind of d3 knight to d2 idea. So I think I am actually going to try this c4 move. I think I'm going to go for this here. If they do take, they play e6. Okay. So now that I've played c4, I am still leaning towards the h4 plan, quite honestly. Maybe I'm I don't know, what's the word? Glutton for punishment, so to speak. These ideas always appeal to me, especially if I am able to encourage black to either take on b1, which would mean I get the bishop pair and maintain my strong knight, or if I'm able to force black to play h6 or h5, and then I can potentially weaken their kingside. I do think the fact that I've played c4 is making it more so the case that I'm okay making that exchange on g6 later. All that being said, I think it's just a long-winded way of saying that I think I am going to go for h4 here, with the idea to play h5. Now, it won't necessarily win the bishop if I play h5, because again, bishop takes b1 is available, but it would force black to make an exchange of a bishop who has moved around, you know, 1, 2, 3 times, and then a 4th time to take the knight on b1, and the knight hasn't moved at all. So that would kind of be like black wasted almost like 4 moves, is the way you could think of it. If he does take on b1, I'm leaning towards just using the rook to recapture. I could take with the queen. I don't think the queen's doing a whole lot special on the b1 square, so I think I would lean towards using the rook. The rook on b1 could also potentially be useful where it's lined up with the queen on b6. So h5, they take the knight, we take with the rook. Yeah, so they are rushing to make the trade, no problem. I will just take with the rook. And I kind of want black to play a6 before I decide to take on c6. I don't need to rush to make this trade because it's always going to be available. I'd almost rather wait for black to kind of force me to make it, and then I'll go for it. But there's no need to rush making the capture until it's a bit more forced, you could say. Okay, so now that the bishop's gone to d6, one of the drawbacks to this is that the pawn on g7 is no longer protected, and we do have our bishop on b2 eyeing that pawn. So I think we might be able to win material here by playing the move pawn to g5, get this knight to move out of the way, and then potentially looking to capture the pawn on g7 later on. So I think we can go ahead and... I think we can just play g5 right here. I'm trying to decide... I don't really see why not. We could also still throw in the capture on c6 first, then play g5. But again, there might be some scenarios where I want to keep this bishop alive, quite honestly. I think I'm going to play g5 first. And the knight doesn't have a ton of places to go. h5 and g4 are protected by our queen. If it goes to d7, we can take the knight on d7 and then pick up the pawn on g7, and I think black's in bad shape there. We could also take on c6 first and then take on d7. Once again, I think black's in bad shape. If it goes to e4, then we could probably just play d3, I suppose. And I think that's kind of an awkward situation for black to be in. The knight doesn't have a lot of places to move back to once again. Okay, so what are they going to do? Goes to d7. Okay. So I think I am going to go ahead and take on d7. That way the king has to recapture and then black is not able to castle anymore. And then after that, I think I can go ahead and grab the pawn on g7. Now I'm wondering if there's anything better than this. Taking on c6 with the knight doesn't make much sense because after the pawn takes back, my bishop is kind of in a little bit of danger. I also don't really want to take on d5 and ever lose my bishop, so yeah, I think I'm going to make this capture on d7. I may take the pawn on d5 later, under a better circumstance, but I'm not in a rush to do that yet. Let's go ahead and make the capture of the pawn. I think we'll do that. Rook's going to go to g8. We'll move the bishop back to f6 probably, and then maybe we can bring the queen into h5 later to continue attacking stuff. I think the bishop on f6 is in a pretty good spot because it just keeps a lot of control in black's position. They do play a6. I think I'm going to do... I don't want to take just yet, quite honestly, because then the queen will recapture. I think I'm going to retreat the bishop first. Yeah, so there's no point in taking right away. The knight is still pinned. I'm going to move the bishop back first. I might take on d5. I might still take on c6 at the right time, but I kind of want to make black do something, again, before I have to kind of make a decision with the bishop. So they retreat the queen. My bishop is still not in any... There's still no danger to my bishop here, because b5 I can just take the pawn. So I think I can now continue with the queen h5 plan, attacking both of these pawns. And I could also go queen to g4, or even take the pawn on d5, then queen to g4. That check is pretty annoying. The king would have to move to e8. There's no other legal move. And then the king is in a little bit of a weird spot. Now, at the same time, the drawback to that is that once my c4 pawn is gone, then black can play b5 and trap my bishop. So I don't think I'm in a rush to do that necessarily. I think I will go for queen h5, because the threat of queen takes f7 is such a big problem for them. And if I can win the h7 pawn, then I have a h-pawn of my own that can just run down the board and promote at some point. Okay, so they do protect the f7 pawn. We could take h7 right away. Could also play bishop g7 to kick the rook away from protecting the pawn. I think I'll take the pawn on h7. The other threat here is to take the pawn on d5, come back to f5 and give a check, and then get rid of the pawn on d5 after that. And then push the h-pawn, right? Trade the pawns, give the check, and then really just push the h-pawn straight down the board. And there's really not a lot that black can do to stop that. If they do take the pawn on c4, we'll recapture and have a open or half-open file for the rook, which is pretty nice. If they go b5, we'll still just take the pawn. And I think we're in good shape there. It may actually be best for black to play b5, because if they do play b5... Okay, so they're trying to play b5. That's their idea. I think given the circumstance, though... Okay, so I'm going to take on d5 first. They could play b5. b5 here would be a little bit tricky. I mean, I can take the knight. Okay, they take back right away. I think this makes my life a little bit easier. So I can give the check. The king retreats. b5 is still a threat. So for instance, if I take the pawn, they play b5 and my bishop is trapped. I can now take the knight. They take back. And then just push the h-pawn. And I really don't think there's a good answer for black to deal with my h-pawn that's just running down the board here. I really don't see a good way to deal with that, as far as I can tell. I could also just push right away. And then if they go b5, push, they take, push, and then, you know, promoting is still very much happening. I think I will eliminate the knight first, just so I don't have to worry about that. And then I'll just push the h-pawn. And again, there's not really much black can do to stop this. My bishop controls h8. My rook will help to protect the pawn once I push. If they push the pawn to d4, they open up the attack on the rook. I'll just push my pawn to e4 to block that off. And otherwise, I'm just going to shove the h-pawn down the board. Not really much they can do to stop that. Of course, we don't want to push this and lose the rook. Let's just push here to block off the queen. And the king can't even move off of e8. Okay, they play bishop to e7, trying to get rid of this bishop. But I think I can just go queen e5, and black loses material. I fork the rook, I threaten the bishop. Queen e6, I just take the rook there, for instance. Okay, sorry, I did miss the fact that queen d6 was available, but I think here I just trade the queens and push the pawn once again. Take that, push the pawn. There might have been other moves that were good too, but this looks more than good enough. We're going to have... black is going to have to give the rook up pretty soon. Here I don't need to trade. I want to keep the bishop alive for a little bit longer. I'll attack the rook that's on the b8 square to do that. And once the rook moves, then we'll push the pawn, and then there's not much black can do to stop us from promoting. Okay, well here we'll just take that. Push there, has to put the rook in front of it. And then we'll play f4. And we'll just move the king out, defend the g-pawn, play f5, g6, g7. That's the game plan here. All right, let's get the king out of the way, swing over. Okay, move the rook over. F5 check, g6. Just move the king to the f3 square. I can even take with the rook here. Maybe that's even simpler. If I take with the pawn, they have... here, let's just do this and attack the bishop, which has nowhere to go. And okay, they end up resigning here. We're just going to win the bishop. We're going to promote the pawn later, and that's that. So yeah, so I think I played this correctly in the sense of the middle game plan here. If you did see the previous episode of the speedrun, you saw a very similar type of position where I had the bishop on b5 and the knight on e5. I think I misplayed that game a bit more in comparison. I think in this particular one, I did a better job of handling things. So let's go back over to the game review area and we'll check out the game there. All right, looks like we played at a 94.8% accuracy. One mistake. We'll find out where that was, but for the most part, it looks like we had the advantage the entire game and eventually won. So let's move over to the analysis side of things. So knight f3, c5, b3, d5. Very important to play the move e3 here. If we go bishop to b2, then pawn to f6, this is generally speaking a setup that's pretty good for black. They can play e5 without us being able to prevent it easily. So I go for e3. Knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g4. We make the pin, knight f6. We attack the bishop. Now black's best move is to retreat the bishop back to the d7 square. And if they do that, probably we just castle. If they attack the bishop, we make the exchange. We put the knight on e5. And we're trying to weaken black's pawn structure by taking the bishop on c6 and doubling their pawns. Even if that doesn't happen, we can still attack the center. And white has a perfectly good position, even though we had to trade off one of our bishops. Instead, though, I think black makes a pretty common error here. They retreat the bishop back to the h5 square, which does now allow us to play g4, bishop retreats, knight e5, and there's a lot of pressure on black's position. They went for the move queen to b6 to protect the knight as well as attack the bishop, and apparently it was actually best for me to trade the bishop for the knight and then play h4. I was a little bit spooked, you could say, by the second game of the previous episode in the speedrun series where stuff like this did not work out very well. But I guess in this particular version of things, you know, if black plays h6, we take on g6, and it looks like it's a better version of things compared to that previous game in the other episode. Again, if you haven't seen that episode, you'll probably want to go watch that one. That will explain a little bit more why I was a little apprehensive about taking on c6 and playing h4. Ultimately, though, this particular position, that is a good way to play. In the other game, it was less of a good way to play. So, anyways, though, I decided to go for the move c4 here. This is going to be the mistake that was labeled in the game review. But we still end up with a pretty good position. So, I still did go for h4. They took on b1, take back with the rook. And now it's just a very pleasant position for us. Bishop d6. We attack the knight moved. Apparently taking on c6 is a little bit better, but taking on d7 is still a pretty large advantage for white. We win the pawn on g7, we put the bishop on f6. And then bishop a4, keeping the bishop alive, is fine to play. Taking on c6 would have also been fine, it looks like. I decide to keep the bishop alive, then I attack the pawns. I picked up the h7 pawn, trade d5, check. Decided to make the trade of bishop for knight before it got trapped. And then really the game plan, ever since I won the h-pawn, the real plan was just to push the h-pawn to promote. And the nice thing is our bishop on f6 does a really nice job protecting that promotion square. And there's really not a good way that black can stop this pawn from promoting. He played d4, we played e4. Apparently rook to h4 is even better. Okay. Now you're threatening rook to e4. That would actually be much more decisive. Yeah, this is much better than playing pawn to e4. Okay, so e4 was a bit of a... still a very good position, but rook h4 would have been much more crushing. I pinned the bishop, trade the queens, push the pawn, decide to hit the rook. Ultimately, black is just completely lost here. I took with the rook instead of the pawn. Taking with the pawn would have also been fine. Black ended up resigning here because he's going to lose the bishop. Or he's going to get mated or something like that. So yeah, we got the win on this one. Let's go ahead and move on to the next game and check that one out. All right, we got game number 2 here. We're playing against Glacier 1761. We're going for our Ready Nimzo Larsen approach again. Knight f3, knight f6, b3. and they go for g6. So, interestingly enough, I don't think we've seen very many knight f6, g6, bishop g7 setups in the speedrun series here, even though I do think it is one of the more common ways that black can play against the ready Nimzo Larsen. Pretty much this is an approach that could be played by people who play the King's Indian Defense, the Grunfeld, the Perk, the Modern, pretty much any of these openings that people play. They're going to play knight f6, g6, bishop g7. Against this, we're going to put our bishop on b2, and then we're going to fianchetto the other bishop. And we're going to play a bit around how black defines the pawn structure in the center. If they go d6, we'll go d4. If they go d5, we'll go c4. And if they go c5, we'll go c4. So pretty much, okay, so yeah, they are going for d6. They would like to play the move e5. We're not going to let that happen. We've talked lots about this in previous episodes. We don't want to let our opponent play the move e5 to shut down our bishop. We are definitely trying to fight for control of these dark squares in the center of the board. Now, there's various ways that black can play around this e5 idea. They can go knight to d7 and try to punch through with e5. Knight c6 to punch through. They can even push right away, quite honestly. And if we take, they can move the knight and set up a pin and look to regain the pawn. That's also completely possible. But all of these positions where black plays e5, and even if they do get the pawn back, it tends to be scenarios, in my opinion, that are quite pleasant for white. We'll see if black plays around this type of idea. But I'm almost always happy to face opponents who try to get through the move e5. I tend to have a pretty good score against these types of setups. I'm kind of hoping that's what they go for because they'll be able to explain it pretty well. If they don't go for e5 though, then what we're going to do is we're going to castle. And we're going to go for some kind of c4, knight c3. Okay, we're going to castle first. Let's see what they do. But the general idea is sometimes we'll go for c4 and knight c3, sometimes we'll go for knight to d2, sometimes we'll go rook e1 and e4, and even other times we'll go a4, a5, and just grab queenside space. And you might kind of wonder, well, okay, you just listed 4 different setups, so, which one am I supposed to go for? It does depend a little bit on what black does, and I'll try to explain this as best as I can throughout this video. Here, for instance, black is playing the move rook to e8. They really want to play the move e5, and here the move that I believe is recommended in the chessable course that myself and Grandmaster Yaroslav Zerbuk made. I'm pretty sure it's the move a4, and that might seem like a really weird move. You might wonder, like, why in the world would you play a4? So black wants to play e5. Now, e5 does not really work right now, I will say. It looks like they're setting it up. It looks like if you imagine they played the move e5 here, we take, they take, we can actually end up taking the pawn another time. They take with their knight, but then we can trade the queens, pull the rook away from protecting the knight, and then we can take the knight on e5 with the bishop once they take back. And there we are going to be up a pawn. We're even attacking the c7 pawn in some situations. Now, if I play a move like c4 here. c4 is fine to play, I will say. c4 is okay. a4 is okay. You don't want to play a move like rook e1 here. Rook e1 is sometimes an idea because you want to play the move e4 yourself without kind of committing the knight off of the b1 square just yet. The problem with rook e1 is after the move e5, pawn takes, knight takes, black has a trick in that position. Black can play the move knight to g4, taking advantage of this lineup, the bishop on g7, pinning our knight on e5 down to the bishop on the b2 square. Now, you might wonder, why would rook e1 affect that? Why can't black play this move after, in that first variation we talked about? In that first variation, we would be able to play the moves knight to d3 or knight to c4 to protect the bishop. If we try to do the same thing, when our rook is on the e1 square, black can trade the bishops and then play this move queen f6. And the queen on f6 would be attacking both our knight on b2 and the pawn on f2. And this is because we moved the rook off of the f1 square. So it's a long-winded explanation. I'll do a bit more explanation in the game review, but I'm going to go with the move a5. I think c4 would also be totally fine. I do like keeping the option of moving the pawn up, moving the knight to c4 in some scenarios. And yeah, for here, I'm going to go ahead and play the move a4. Now, c5 is an interesting approach. The downside, as far as I can tell, of c5 is I think we can just play d5 and gain more of a space advantage. And it's quite awkward for black to break down our center, because they are, like, they can't really play a move like e6 easily, because once we take the pawn on d6 becomes a liability. And this is partly due, in fact, to the knight being on d7. If the knight was not on d7 and the queen was protecting the d-pawn a little bit better, then it would be a bit easier for black to play d6, because then the queen would be guarding the pawn. But they can't really go e6 here, because even if you take with the rook to guard the pawn on d6, we have moves like knight g5 or bishop h3, and we can kick the rook away from protecting the pawn. So if black can't play e6, what I'm going to do next is just play c4, get a bigger space advantage, and black is going to suffer here a bit due to the space disadvantage that they have. If they go knight to b6, I'll still play c4, and then maybe I can even throw in the move a5 to kick the knight around. So this is also actually another useful feature of the a4 pawn. Sometimes you play a5, and you might even kick around a knight that ends up on the b6 square. So he goes for b6. And this gives me the impression that he wants to play bishop to b7, but I really don't think this is a good setup for black to go for, because the pawn on c4 is going to lock in the pawn on d5 too much. So I'm still going to play c4, really just clamp down on this pawn that's giving us a large space advantage. This knight doesn't really have any great squares to move to. The bishop on b7 or a6 are both going to just stare into a rock wall with this pawn chain. e6 still has problems. Also, if he plays e6, the diagonal will be opened up as well, which is useful for us. And probably what I'm going to try to do here is play... Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see here, he plays the move knight b8. It's not a great sign if that's what he's going for. I think I'm going to go for the move rook e1 with the idea of playing pawn to e4. I could also go knight c3 with the same idea, but I'm a little bit annoyed by the move knight to e4, where there might be some exchanges of pieces, and the less pieces on the board, the less the space advantage, the less of an advantage that extra space means. I could also go queen to c2, trying to play e4, but then it walks right into bishop f5. So I think I'm going to go rook e1 and try to play e4. That's my idea. If he plays e6, we will take that, and then the bishop on g2 will be opened up right towards that rook. So the knight going back to b8, maybe he's going to try to maneuver it to the b4 square, but I don't really think it's doing a whole lot there. So I don't think it's all that great. Yeah, it looks like he's going to try to go here, but I'm not really so sure what the game plan is. So I can play e4 right away, or I can maybe even throw in the move h3 first. I'm kind of leaning towards the move h3 first. If we go for e4, black could play bishop g4 and maybe exchange off a pair of pieces. Even there, though, I'd still be quite happy with white's position, considering we still have the space advantage and a pair of bishop advantage. But at the same time, this bishop really has no good squares to go to, and I really want to keep it that way. So h3... Yeah, I'm leaning towards h3. Probably e4 is good too. But again, I don't know. Bishop g4, ever so slightly annoying. He gets to exchange a pair of pieces. I don't know. I'm going to go for h3. I'm assuming he's going to go knight b4 or bishop f5. If he goes bishop f5, my plan is probably just to play maybe just g4 to kick the bishop backwards, or even knight to h4 trying to kick the bishop once again. Something like that. I'm not 100% sure. If he goes knight to b4, I'm just going to play e4. Also, if he goes bishop f5, I might even go knight to d2, trying to play e4. I don't really want to go knight c3 once again, because I don't want to allow these knight e4 ideas and exchange pieces off. Again, when you have a space advantage, especially a kind of a sizable space advantage like we do here, I really just want to keep the space advantage as large as possible. Okay, so here I am going to go for e4. I don't want to let him play bishop f5 and get a knight to c2 or something like that. I feel like that was probably what he was going to try to do. e4 just stops the bishop from moving forward easily. We're taking away all these different squares. b7 looks pretty bad, a6 looks pretty bad, d7 doesn't do a ton. Probably it's the best square, but it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. And in the meantime, I'm just going to develop, move the queen up, maybe double up the rooks on the e-file, and I'm eventually going to try to punch through with the move e5 at the right time. That is the, let's say, pawn break that we want to work towards going for in this kind of position, in this type of pawn structure. A lot of the times, even if you have good, well-placed pieces, e5, interesting. So e5 changes things. Sorry, let me just say what I was going to say before the move e5 happened. So when you have a strong position, well-placed pieces, you generally want to try to open the position up at the right time. You kind of have to move forward to open up lines. And so e5 is the pawn break we want to work towards in the long run. The pawn breaks for black would be b5 and e6, maybe even f5, but that's always a little risky. We already talked about how e6 is not fantastic. It does weaken the d6 pawn. b5 is almost never going to happen, very hard to pull off, and f5 would be pretty risky. So it kind of ends up that black doesn't really have a great pawn break, in my opinion. And so what he tries to do is play e5. And so it's not a pawn break, but it does give me the option of capturing en passant if I want to. And now that the pawn is on e5, I will say that his f5 pawn break becomes a bit more of a possibility, or at least something to work towards. And if I don't have e5 myself, I actually start to lack my own pawn break, which is not a great situation. So I actually think I should take on e6 en passant. It does lose me a little bit of my space advantage, I will say. So it's not without some drawbacks. But what it does allow me to do is I create this weakness on the d6 square. This d6 pawn is a backwards pawn, which is going to always need constant defense. And so now I can consider stuff. I also have the bishop opened up towards the rook, so I could also consider maybe e5 at the right time. But I am ever so slightly behind on development, at least in terms of the minor pieces. So I don't really know if I want to open the position up right now. I think I'm just going to go for knight c3 and continue developing. And part of the plan might even be to just play knight b5 and attack the pawn that's on d6. Queen to d2, rook to d1. The d6 pawn is going to be the big liability that black is stuck worrying about. You can also throw a knight g5 at the right time. That might also be useful. But developing first, maybe knight to b5 to hit the pawn. He goes queen to d7, so now I am actually leaning towards the knight g5 idea. He is threatening the pawn on h3, of course, so I don't want to lose that. Knight g5 kind of kills two birds with one stone. I do defend the pawn. I also attack the bishop, but aside from both of those things, I even have the idea of e5 opening up the discovered attack on the rook on d8, or on a8 here. So he's probably going to play rook to d8, I would assume. And then I'm not really in a rush to take the bishop. It's not really going anywhere. I can take it kind of at my convenience. So I very well may just go for queen to d2, line up, and put more pressure on the d-pawn. And I'll take the bishop at the right time if needed. I can also hop in my knight to d5 at the right time. That's also an idea. I think I'm going to go queen d2 first, though. And again, just line up towards the pawn here on d6. He could try bishop h6, trying to pin my knight. I think I would just go for f4, though. Break the pin and guard the knight. If he ever trades off his dark square bishop, then the dark squares around his king are going to be incredibly weak, which is a very bad thing for him. So rook d1, maybe plop the knight into d5, maybe put the rook on d1 and bring the queen up to the f4 square with some pressure. Maybe even f4, maybe f5 one day. Probably a little bit risky, but is a possibility. So we'll see what black decides to do. Surprisingly, we're not really down much time at this point. We're only down about 30 seconds or so. And I think we have the better position. We have pretty much zero weaknesses. We do have a very slight weak square on d4. Maybe black could try to play knight c6 and go to d4 to take advantage of that. But otherwise, they have a weak d5 square, a weak d6 pawn. Does play h6, so I pretty much have to take the bishop now. If I retreat, he's going to take the pawn, so let's make that capture. But taking back with the pawn, this does protect the d5 square, but it also softens up the g6 pawn a little bit. He plays queen takes e6. Interesting. I think I'm just going to continue with my rook to d1 idea. I think he's going to go knight d7 is my assumption. Okay, I'm going to go for rook d1. If he goes knight to d7, I think I'll play knight to d5. And then he might run into some queen safety issues. Also, knight d7, maybe I can even just take the pawn on d6, actually. Might be okay. Also, knight b5 is still an idea. That would attack the a-pawn and threaten the fork and threaten the pawn. Actually, knight b5 is a pretty big threat. So he stops that, to his credit. I might be able to play e5 here. He takes the pawn. I give up the queen. I mean, not give up, but I get I get 2 rooks for the queen, and then I think he's in a pretty rough position, quite honestly. I think my pieces are just so much more useful than his. I think I'm just going to go for it. I don't know if this is the best way to play or not. But based on the time situation, I'm going to go for this. I think it looks pretty good for us. And it opens up the bishop on g2. It gives us the control of the wide open file. I'm going to double up the rooks here, and I think I'm just going to try to bring this rook to d6, or one of the rooks to d6, and then pick off the pawn that's on the b6 square. I could have also probably moved the knight off of c3 or something, but I'm going to go for this plan. Okay, I think I'm going to go rook here. He has e3 and knight d3, which are kind of annoying, I will say. I can even go back to e1, quite honestly, and just try to attack the pawn. You know what? I'm going to do that. I'm actually just going to go back to e1. If he goes knight to d3, I'll just take that. Okay, well, this is a blunder from him. I was pretty much just switching back to e1 to target the e4 pawn. I don't think he had a really good way of protecting it. So that was my my idea there. Okay, well, here I'm just going to play rook e3, and this pawn is a goner. I maybe could have taken it as well just a second ago, but it's done for. There's nothing he can do to save it. We'll take that. If he trades, I'll take with the bishop, and also that will pin the queen. Yeah, we'll just make the exchange. He resigns. If he took with the bishop, I was going to play the move bishop to e4 to pin the queen. So that would be game over. Okay, so we got the win here. I think it was a pretty clean game. I will go back in the game review and talk more about kind of the middle game pawn structure that could have arisen if you had played e5. So let's jump into the game review and talk about that. All right, so we played at a 93.9% accuracy. 1 mistake, 2 inaccuracies. We'll check out where those were. Somewhere in here, yeah, I think that this might have been this jump on the graph. I think that's where he played knight to d3. So it might actually have been the case. Well, let's check it out. So let's see how things went. Knight f3, knight f6, b3, g6, develop, g3, bishop g2. We do play the move d4 in response to d6 so that black doesn't get to play e5. If we castle, pawn to e5, slightly annoying position for white because black gets to block our bishop and knight out. Instead, though, we go for the move d4. I did mention during the game, if black had played d5, we would go for the move c4. As you can see, according to the computer, is the best move. And if black plays the move c5, we would also go for c4. Again, according to the computer, it's the best move. Pretty much here, what you don't want to allow is you don't want to allow black to play both d5 and c5 without us being able to do something about it. So for example, if black played d5 and we castled, which is not so great, black's best move is to play c5. And now if we try to play c4, it's a bit too late. He plays the move d4, and our bishop kind of gets shut in, and we end up playing kind of a Benoni type of pawn structure, which is not something we want to do. If we try to go for d4, now the problem is he can take on d4, we have to take back with one of our two pieces, and then black is inevitably at the right time going to just play e5. Like e5 here, and then e4, and black just gets a big space advantage without any real drawback to it. Okay, so again, you have to make sure you're knowing which pawn to push at the right time. After, for instance, if they go d6, you don't want to go c4 here because they get to play e5. And if they go, something like d5, you don't want to play d4 because your own bishop is shut in unnecessarily. So, kind of understanding the use of the c and d pawns, when to push them up to c4 and d4 or d3, various things like that, or some of the nuances of this opening for sure. So after d6, though, we play d4 to prevent e5, knight d7, castle, and I did mention during the game that black could play e5 right here. It is possible. If they take, if they take back, here we do just simply get to win a pawn. After all of this, we are just up one pawn, which is good. They could try a move like knight to g4. The idea of that is to win the pawn back on e5, because they have so many pieces piling up on it, and the pawn, we cannot take the pawn on d6, for example, because we would lose the bishop on b2. This type of pawn structure I think is quite good for white, though. I would generally go with the move queen to c1 here, I think is the move I would focus on. And then if black take, mainly to guard the bishop, so now we're threatening to take the pawn. And if they do a couple of trades on e5, we play c4, and it's a better pawn structure for white because we have more space. It's a little bit tricky for black to develop the queen side without losing the b pawn. And if they ever play a move like c6, then they end up with a weak pawn on d6, and that's a weakness that we can go attack later. Now, they played rook e8 in the game, and I did go for the move a4, which, as you can see, according to the computer, is one of the top two moves. c4 is also good, which I mentioned during the game. Now, the idea here is, let's imagine we play some random move. Let's say like h3, and let's say black plays, or h3 is not a great example. Let's say rook e1, right? Rook e1, black plays e5. We take, they take. We are not able to take the pawn on e5 in this position, as I mentioned during the game. When our rook is on e1, this does not work, because black will play this move knight to g4, taking advantage of this line up towards our bishop on b2. If we take on g4, we just lose the bishop and the rook in the corner, which is bad for us. But it is important here to recognize that because we moved the rook off of the f1 square, if we try to move the knight back to d3 or c4 to protect the bishop, here black can trade the bishops and then play this move queen f6. And I mentioned this during the game. Here we're in big trouble. If you try to move the knight to guard the pawn, you lose the rook in the corner, which is bad. Now, this does not really work the same way for black after a move like a4, because now if they play e5, which they didn't do in the game, but if they had played e5, we take, they take, we take, knight g4 does nothing now, because after knight d3, take, queen f6, here the pawn on f2 is defended, and we can just play a move like rook a2, for example. Looks a little bit weird, but we get away from the pin, we guard the knight, and we are just up a pawn, which is good for us. So, so e5, it still works if black wants to play knight g4 afterwards, but, here we can play, knight to d2, e4. The position is a little bit better for white at the end of the day. Instead, though, our opponent went for the move c5, and here we go for the move d5. Other moves are playable as well, but I do like the idea of d5, just gaining more space. And it's a big reason that this is good for us is because it's quite hard for black to get rid of, it's hard for them to get rid of this d5 pawn. If they try to play e6, which is the typical pawn break they would like to play, we can go ahead and take the pawn. The rook takes to guard the pawn. I was thinking about moves like knight g5, for example, but you can also just simply continue developing. The main issue for black is they're going to have kind of this weakish pawn on d6, you can play c4. And kind of like the game, they're going to have this weak pawn on d6 for a long time. So what black would really like to do is play e6 and then take back with the bishop. But they can't do that because the knight on d7 is in the way. So they played b6, c4 to reinforce the center, knight to b8, rook to e1, knight a6, h3. Labels h3 as an inaccuracy. I did mention during the game that maybe e4 is better. I thought black would play bishop g4, but apparently this is just better for white. I'm not surprised it's better for white. I thought it was, you know, somewhat helpful for black to be able to trade off their bad piece, but okay. h3 is not the end of the world. And then we do play e4 now. They play e5. And notice here it is important to capture this, to make this en passant capture, because essentially if we don't capture on e6 here, we have a little bit of a hard time coming up with a pawn break of our own, and the position is very, very closed. Usually what you would do in this type of pawn structure is you would try to play for a b4 pawn break on the queen side, but we've already made that really hard to do by playing a4, so it's very unlikely we would ever make the move b4 work, and also black could always play a5 and just completely shut that idea down. The only pawn breaks that are really left over for each player are to play either f4 or f5, and it always is a little harder to pull off f4 than it is for black to play f5 in these positions, in my opinion. I don't really know how to explain the reason for that. It just tends to be that, like, the bishop on b2 is not protecting the f4 pawn if we do push there. Black does have the bishop on c8 protecting their f5 pawn if they push. There's some reasons that make it a little bit harder for us to make that pawn, to play this pawn structure. So for that reason, I think it's, as we see here, it's very important to capture en passant, because we do create this weakness on d6. We do lose a little bit of our space advantage, but we give this weakness to black on the d6 square. So we develop the knight. I played knight g5 to protect the h3 pawn, then queen to d2, then we did have to take the bishop, and then went for rook to d1, a6, and probably this e5 move is not the best. Yeah, it does say e5 is not the best. It ends up working out very quickly in the game, but it's not the best way to play. It's better to play a little bit more slowly and in control. King h2, f4, just kind of slow improvement moves are better than trying to jump the gun by playing e5 in the center. White is still a little bit better after all of this, but not so much after I double up the rooks, apparently. Apparently e4 is fine for black to play, but the big mistake was knight d3. Knight d3 was the huge blunder. We win the material here. If he had taken, here we're just simply ahead one piece. That's very good for us. So that was a big mistake from our opponent. Apparently if they play knight to c2 though, and then knight to e3, maybe they take the pawn on b3 at the right time. It gets a little bit messy. The game is back to being a little bit more equal than I would like it to be, but black is not doing too badly at this point. So e5 was a bit overambitious there in the center of the board. Better to just kind of continue building up the position instead. We both were a little bit low though. I decided to play e5. It worked out in the game, but yeah, maybe in the hindsight it was not the best move. Anyways though, we get the win on this one. This was our second game. Let's go ahead and get into our third one after this. All right, we've got our third game here, playing against a Zizli champion, 2014. Technically, this guy's 1 point below 2100, but okay, pretty much on the cusp there. So after knight f3 and c5, we go for b3. And we'll see what black decides to do here. Knight to c6. Let's go bishop to b2. If d5, we'll go e3. If knight f6, we'll have to decide at that point. Okay, so they go for d6. So this is an interesting move order here. So what we have to be a bit careful about, as usual, is they could play the move e5. Next move, trying to blunt in our bishop. And usually the remedy for stopping the move e5 from happening is to play the move d4. But with this particular way of doing things, it does end up that if we go d4, black takes, we're not able to recapture with the pawn. We would have to recapture with our knight. And then it would still give black the possibility of playing e5. But the reason we're going to go for this here is because, quite honestly, we don't really have another way of playing around it, I will say. And even if they play e5 and we trade knights on c6, we kind of end up in a pawn structure where black does have more space, but we would be able to play moves like c4, g3, and bishop g2, and we're going to be able to put some pressure on their center. They go for knight s6 first, though. With that being the case, I think we're going to go for the move g3, put the bishop on g2, and look to apply pressure to the knight that's on the c6 square. And yeah, we're going to play it like this. Bishop g2, castle, assuming they guard the knight. Now we're threatening to take the knight 2 times with the fork. Probably they have to play bishop d7 as they are. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go to castle. And then next we're going to play c4 to grab more space in the center. We'll do that here. And it's going to kind of resemble a bit of a Sicilian defense type of position. You could imagine if black plays, c5, we go d4, they take, we take. It's not exactly a Sicilian defense because the pawn's not on the e4 square, but it's sort of, if we do play e4 at some point, we would have a Maroczy bind pawn structure, which is generally a pretty good setup to have against the Sicilian defense because you start off with a pretty nice space advantage. Now, I don't think we can go for e4 right now, though. Maybe we could, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe we could. Maybe it would be fine to do, quite honestly. But I'm not going to rush that just yet. I'm going to go for... Let's see here. How do we want to approach this? I think I'm just going to go for knight c3. Yeah, I think I'm just going to develop and focus on getting more pieces in the game at this point. We'll kind of see what black decides to do. If they take on d4, we'll take back with the queen. They go for rook to c8. I think we can just go rook to c1. Or maybe now we can go e4. e4 now also looks perfectly good. Even e3. Even e3 just to guard the knight. And if they take our knight, we take back with the pawn. That also looks totally fine here, quite honestly. One of the general ideas for black against this c4 kind of space gaining move, black wants to play the moves a6 and b5. And we have a little bit of a harder time stopping that pawn break because usually you would have a bishop on the f1 square kind of controlling that b5 square. Little bit harder to defend that square in this particular case. So with that in mind, okay, I think I'm just going to go rook c1. I think there's lots of good moves here, quite honestly. I think e3 looked good, e4 looks good. Rook c1 looks totally fine. He decides to trade. He's going to play bishop c6, I assume. And now the question is how to respond here. First of all, I think we can just take the a-pawn. Am I missing something here? I don't see why we can't take the a-pawn. Is there an idea I'm missing? I don't think so. Now the question is, do we take the bishop then the pawn, or just take the pawn right away? I feel like we just take the pawn right away. Yeah, I don't see the problem with this. I think he needed to play, I think he really needed to play a6 first, like a6 here, and then he could play knight takes knight and bishop c6. Now, he can't play a6 here either, I will say, because the b7 pawn's hit. So it's actually the case where both pawns are hit, and he actually just doesn't have a good way to guard both. So he loses the a-pawn, taking with the king. He offered a draw there. I'm not accepting the draw. I'm just up a pawn. Here I think we can just do... Probably I'll just do queen to b6. I think he wants to check. Rook to a8 is not that big of a deal. The a2 pawn is defended, so I don't think that's too much of a problem. Could also just go rook to d1 or something like that. also looks totally fine. He might want to check and then play b6 though, and then my queen does start running a little bit low on squares. So I think I'm going to bring the queen back just a little bit first. If he wants to attack it with the rook, then I will back up even further. Here though, I think I can just pin the pawn. Yeah, I think I can just pin the pawn here. I think he has to play e6 to defend it. And then I think we can take the pawn or play e4 or something like that. Yeah, I think he's going to run into trouble with the pin on this pawn. If you move forward, I'll just take it. You take, of course, we get the queen. I gotta move the queen, of course. I guess I can just go to the b5 square. He might play d4 there, though. Then I can always play e3. I don't think that's too big of a problem, quite honestly. If I go to d4, I have to worry about the discovered attacks. Even there, though, if he moves the knight, I can play queen takes d5, so I don't think that's too big of a problem. I think I'll just go here, though. Let's go here. We attack the pawn. We pin the rook a little bit. If he pushes here, we'll go e3 and continue attacking the pawn. We can also move, if he plays d4, we can also just like move the knight away somewhere, and then the pawn on d4 is piled up one. e3, d3, maybe? I think here I'll just move the knight away, though. Let's go knight a4, and I think I'm just piling up on the pawn. He can play e5, but then I think I can just take the pawn with queen takes e5. Or I can even still play e3 to attack the pawn once again. Queen to g4, okay. Does attack this pawn. But I can take the pawn on b7 attacking the rook, I think, right? I think I can do this to attack the rook. If he takes the pawn, I'll just take the rook in that case. We can also take the pawn on d4, let him take the pawn on e2, and it's really not that big of a deal. If he plays rook e6, might even just bring the queen back to f3 to trade stuff. Yeah, I think we'll just go queen f3 to offer a trade. He could play rook takes e2, but then we'll play rook takes d4, and yeah, that's totally fine. Just do this. He's got to trade the queens now. I guess he could play queen e6, but then knight c5, and we're just going to try to kick the queen away from protecting the rook. Our bishop on b2 is defended, so that's kind of an important thing to notice here. And once he trades the queens, then the rook on e2 is also hit, which is nice. Yeah, he pretty much has to trade. We're threatening, of course, to take the queen, and anything else he does will take the rook, or queen e6 is the only move he can try, but then knight c5 will kick the queen away from protecting the rook again. So we're down about 3 minutes, but yeah, we're up 2 pawns, and we're about to have a queen trade occur, most likely. And so we are firmly having a pretty large advantage, even if we are a little bit behind on the clock. So we'll see what black does. I don't think he really has anything better than trading queens, quite honestly. If he tries knight e4 or something weird. Yeah, so he does trade the queens. He might take the bishop, I'm not sure. He decides to move backwards. Now I have to be a little bit careful about this particular lineup. Probably the simplest thing is just to bring the rook back to the first rank. If this knight moves, we'll just trade pieces. And next I'll play knight c5, and just also I can just push the c-pawn up the board. Always important when you're ahead material, get the queens off the board, trade pieces, but also most importantly, I would say, aside from those two things, just try to negate the counterplay that your opponent has. No need to let any funny business happen. Don't need to do anything fancy. So I think I'll just go knight c5, and then knight d7, and trade the bishops and trade the knights, and trade is the name of the game. Okay. Could have also played h3, I guess, a moment ago. I think he wants to go rook here. But then I think I'll take on d7, or sorry, I'll take on f6. Probably this is something I shouldn't have allowed, but I think I can take on f6. Yeah, let's do this. And then knight to d7 once he takes back with the bishop. Just trade more stuff. He's probably going to play rook a8. I'll take the bishop with check. He takes back, and then I'll just play a4. Eliminate that. Push that. I'll put the rook on b1 next move. And then I'll just start pushing the pawns pretty much. Put the rook here. And we'll just start pushing the c-pawn. He's going to try to bring the rook down to attack the f2 pawn, for sure. And we just have to be a little bit careful here. Probably I'll go rook d1. I don't think it matters. I could also just push. Rook comes down, rook goes to f1. He puts the rook behind. I put the other rook behind. I have to be a little bit careful. Let's do this. Offer a trade of rooks first. He's going to go for the other open file. He's for sure going to play rook e8, no question. And then he's going to put the rook back on d8. I'll bring the other rook to d1. So I'll control both of the open files so that his rooks can't double up and attack the f1. He'll play rook c8, of course. And here I can probably... Yeah, let's do it this way. I'm going to go rook c8. He's going to put rook on d8. I'm going to push the pawn to c6. And then he's going to play rook to d2. I'm going to play rook f1. And now I can just push the pawn down the board. I can just push. And we get the win. Okay, so we got the win there. Yeah, I think our opponent mostly just lost a couple pawns in the late opening, kind of early middle game phase of things. But yeah, let's take a look at it in the game review and check the game out there. All right, looks like we played at a 90.0% average to our opponent's 82.7. We had one mistake, two inaccuracies, one mistake, and two misses. So definitely some better moves could have been played at some point in here. Let's go ahead and review the game to see what we could have done better with. So knight f3, c5, b3, knight c6, bishop e2, d6. Yeah, so here black wants to play the move e5, and essentially here if we don't stop them from playing e5, they're going to get a pretty nice space advantage. The move d4 is the move that I recommend here. Now, if black had done something a little bit different earlier, let's say they had done d6 without the knight being on c6 just yet, here I would actually recommend playing c4, oddly enough. d4 is not as good when there's no knight on c6 to capture, because after black takes and then plays e5, we don't have knight takes c6 available, we'd have to go back to f3. And probably this position is still totally fine for white, but we haven't been able to trade the knights on c6. Whereas in the game version of things, if black does play e5 in this position, then we would be able to trade knights on c6, play the move. I would have probably played g3 myself, bishop g2, castle, c4, and black has a little more space in the center, but white's pieces are pretty well placed nonetheless. So instead, though, he played knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop d7, castle, bishop g7, c4, and we get a pretty comfortable position here. We have a little more space than our opponent because of the c4 pawn, and that is really just the main source of our slight advantage at this point. So we develop the knight, rook to c8, rook to c1, and here black, I think, kind of makes a bit of an error by taking on d4 right away, because after queen takes d4, it's actually quite difficult for them to defend both of these pawns at the same time. The computer says the best move is to play b6, which does defend both things, but this is not really what black wants, I would say. Black really wants to play a6, then b5 to attack our c4 pawn. If they play b6, they'll have to play a6, then b5, and they'll have moved the b pawn twice, which is a little bit of a waste of time. Though it is better than losing the pawn, because after bishop c6, we just went ahead and took the pawn for free, and black is already worse. And the computer says there's really even only one move to be not really badly off, you could say. Knight g4 is the best move. I think the idea of knight g4 is to eliminate the knight so that you can play rook to a8 and take on a2. I think that's the idea. For instance, if we play like rook to d1, actually not only just to eliminate the knight, it's actually just to trap the queen. Because we don't have the e3 or d4 squares available. So we'd actually have to be pretty careful about black trapping our queen here. But if we do something like take the bishop and then queen a3, apparently, we can block with knight a4, and white is still up a pawn with a better position for sure. In the game, though, black traded pieces, which we're very happy about considering that we're ahead of pawn. Then we played queen to b6, d5. Queen to b6, it says, is a mistake. Apparently just playing rook to d1 first is better. I was a little bit worried about the check, but probably in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that big of a deal. We can always just move the queen backwards, and we're doing totally fine here. So I went to b6 first, though. d5 was bad because we get to pin the pawn. It says rook to d1 was an inaccuracy, which is kind of surprising. It says using the c rook is better, which feels a little bit weird, but okay. Rook f d1, then queen b5. Apparently not the best move. Better to move the queen to some other squares instead, but nonetheless, after d4, knight a4, apparently black is somewhat in the game, but after all of this, yeah, they were eventually down 2 pawns, and the game is pretty much over at this point. We trade pieces, we trade stuff, we push. And again, the biggest thing in these situations is you don't want to just blindly ignore what your opponent's doing and focus on your own game plan instead. For example, if I push c6 here and the rook goes to d2, I can't keep pushing because rook takes f2 is going to lead to a perpetual check here. I would have to play rook f1, then black could play rook to c2, and then if I try to play rook to c1 here, black has... I thought they could maybe get away with rook takes f2 check, but I guess even here I can just take the pawn on f6 or start pushing the pawns. Anyways, white is still significantly better, but again, I wanted to stop all of that counterplay to begin with. So I hit the rook, shut down the file, shut down the other file, and then only now did I start pushing the pawn, because the difference is they can't put one of the rooks behind the pawn like they tried in the game, because the difference is my rook is already on the c1 square, they're not really threatening anything, and I can just push the pawn. And they ended up resigning here because the only way they stopped the pawn is by sacrificing the rook for it, and then we would be up a 4 rook with an easily winning position there. So, yeah, I think we kind of capitalized mostly on our opponent's mistake that allowed us to take the a7 pawn for free. Didn't play perfectly after that, but did well enough to keep the advantage, eventually won a second pawn, and then focused on shutting down the opponent's counterplay when we were ahead material, and that helped us to have an easier time winning the game. So anyways, though, that is the third game of this episode. We have progressed all the way through the rating range. We played players starting off from the rating of 600 all the way to players between 2100 and 2200. Technically, the account is at 2111 right now at this point, but we have played against players in every single rating bracket, all the way from 600 up to 2200, and that will be the most likely the final episode of the speedrun. I will still be making other videos focusing on the Ready Nimzo Larsen, but it may be from a little bit of a different angle, maybe not a speedrun episode specifically. It might be more of a, here's a couple of games with a particular setup in the Ready Nimzo Larsen, or a couple of games where our opponents do a particular opening setup. But those will be videos for a future time. So you don't have to worry that I'm not making any more Ready Nimzo Larsen videos if you've been enjoying them. But if you have been enjoying the speedrun series and the content, there will be more to come. I appreciate you watching the episodes, and I'll be back with another video in the near future. See you later.